Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Okay, so today we're revisiting the case of the Zodiac Killer, and I was contacted by someone in one of my previous uploads, just in the comments section here on YouTube, and this guy was writing to me to tell me about Louis Myers, a suspect that we covered ages ago, but he wrote to me to say that he is actually the nephew of Louis Myers, and we began to have a sort of conversation, if you will, and this isn't exactly a traditional interview. I'm just going to kind of relay some of the material that we discussed in our discussion about the possibility of Louis Myers being the Zodiac Killer. First, I would really thank him for everything he did. It's just, I thought he was going to say something at first like, I find your comments insensitive, that's my family you're talking about, but in fact, he is a supporter of the theory. He is someone who believes that Louis Myers could have possibly been the Zodiac Killer, even though Myers is his uncle. So, Louis Myers, just to give the smallest introduction, is somebody who became a suspect because he gave a deathbed confession, allegedly, to his friend Randy Kenny, and then Randy Kenny went public to the media outlets. Now, Myers also confessed in the 1970s that he was the Zodiac Killer to a long-haul trucker. He has definitive connections to Darlene Ferrin and Betty Lou Jensen. Not to mention, in Darlene Ferrin's restaurant, he was a busboy. Darlene Ferrin was working as a waitress, and Myers was a busboy there. Alright, so, definitive connection to multiple victims. This is sort of a theory of someone targeting the lover's lanes because he is jealous. Except for Paul Stine, the reason why there's a differentiation between the Paul Stine murder and the previous lover's lane murders is that Louis Myers simply did it for drug money. Okay, so I'm exchanging messages with his nephew, and we're having this kind of discussion on it. And I was like, what about some of the other things associated with Myers? And he's like, wait, you've left out some big things. And I was like, what are you talking about? And we got on the subject of Sherry Jo Bates. I was kind of promoting the Louis Myers theory that it eliminated the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966. In 1968, Louis Myers would have been only 17 years old. The first killings of the Zodiac were December 20th, 1968. Sherry Jo Bates was murdered on October 30th, 1966, and her body was found on Halloween morning, October 31st, 1966. And I'm like, hey, that would mean that Louis Myers would have been 15 years old at the time of the Sherry Jo Bates murder. And I'm like, I admitted that it was somewhat of a stretch, but, I mean, I was just like, what, do you think it's plausible that a 15-year-old murdered Sherry Jo Bates? His response was simple. He's just like, if you're a killer, there is no age limit to being a murderer. I mean, more or less. And I did say that, though. I did say that during my very first Louis Myers upload. It might have actually been in part 2, but I was just like, teenagers can kill people. Most people do not think that Sherry Jo Bates was murdered by a 15-year-old, but the reason why we got on this subject was, he's like, what did Louis Myers name his first daughter? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, he named his first daughter Sherry. So says this guy who claims that he is Myers' nephew. He says that the first daughter of Louis Myers was named Sherry, spelled the same way, Cheri. And I was like, wow, I mean, that makes your hair stand up a little bit. And that's one of the things that I noticed about a lot of the things in the Zodiac lore, just in the Zodiac discussions and what you're reading on forums, especially the stuff about Richard Gaikowski, and to an extent Arthur Lee Allen. But especially with Gaikowski, a lot of the things that they're saying about him, it's like, I think the internet is adding in a certain amount of fabrications. And we were talking about a few things recently about Arthur Lee Allen, where some people on the internet might also be fabricating or putting out misleading information about Arthur Lee Allen. When it comes to the case of Louis Myers, though, somebody who is like kind of a lesser-known suspect, I don't even believe he is featured on ZodiacKiller.com. It's like, there's going to be less of it because Myers isn't that well known. And it's like, I don't want to doubt this guy. I mean, he says he's the primary source on it, so I'm approaching it with an open mind. Okay, so he names his first daughter Sherry. Is that an eerie coincidence? But I was like, Wait, how do we know that Myers was in Riverside in 1966? I mean, the Zodiac killer operated in the Bay Area. How do we know for certain that Myers was in Riverside, California? And his explanation was simple, that it was very normal for Louis Myers and other family members to take off and go on sort of like, just to take off for 4 days at a time, and they would go all over California. That was very normal behavior, and they're just kind of like going out, but they're staying out for 4 days, and they're going all over the state, so it's very plausible that he would have been in Riverside. People are just going off and doing their own thing, and going to different parts of the state, and kind of just running wild, for lack of a better term. Alright, so that's one thing. So he's giving an explanation about why he believes that Myers was in Riverside, California. He's kind of just running off with other guys, doing his own thing, going a little bit crazy. I don't know if that necessarily means that he murdered Sherry Jo Bates, but we're examining the case, and that could be a possible reason why he was in Riverside, California. Moving on to the next point, which I think is a little bit more interesting. The ciphers. My biggest challenge to the Louis Myers theory is that there's no explanation for the ciphers. And this is coming from a guy like me who used to believe that Louis Myers was my top suspect in the Zodiac killer. I was just like, all the boxes are answered. This is such a plausible explanation. Definitive connections to the victims. Not to mention that he had the alibi about being in the army in Germany from 1971 to 1973, ceasing Zodiac activity. But once you start going through other suspects, almost all of the major suspects have an explanation about why they did not have any Zodiac activity from 1971 to 1973. But in the case of Myers, I was like, where is the answer to the cipher? It's like, and I came up with the response that Randy Kenny couldn't fabricate that. It's like, that is something that could not be fabricated. Maybe the theory about Louis Myers was almost fitting too much like a glove. It was almost too well done, like it was almost constructed. But they couldn't fabricate an answer to the ciphers because Randy Kenny simply did not know. And once again, that's just a possibility. That is total speculation. So when you have the other thing going on with the ciphers, what could be the explanation? Okay, so one of the things that this guy is telling me, Louis Myers' nephew, explained about that is that Myers spent a lot of time with his grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, and in the Navy, and he learned coding. And Myers was very big in reading up on the stuff, learning from his grandfather, and he would have had the knowledge to learn about codes. And it's actually interesting that in the Lawrence Kane theory, they believe that he composed the ciphers because of also serving in the Navy. That it's a very similar thing, that except they're saying that Myers learned from his grandfather, whereas Lawrence Kane was actually in the Navy. But he was like, he had the opportunity to learn about codes, to learn about cryptography, to learn about the kind of coding sequence. And as far as the final cipher, which still remains unsolved, the explanation that was provided by his nephew was that it's just, some of it's just far out stuff that's meant to be kind of confusing on purpose. He's kind of just playing around. It might not have any precise meaning. And I've said that very frequently on the channel, especially when we were talking about the George Hill Hodel theory, about how there was a card that was mailed on Halloween to Paul Avery, the reporter, and there's that symbol that had been translated to say Hodel, and that would mean that the final cipher, it's a long explanation, but the final Zodiac cipher is just a series of symbols. I did say, though, in the past, that Louis Myers was very big into his Celtic symbology, and I kind of use that term. But what Randy Kenny said is that the Zodiac symbol is nothing more than a Celtic cross, because Myers was proud of his heritage. I believe Scottish heritage, they said specifically. But, it's like, that's a Celtic cross. So then I'm like, all right, he has some fascination with Celtic symbology. That was my term, though, that it's not really anyone else is saying that. But then when you sort of look at what his nephew is saying, he could have learned about cryptography from his grandfather, and the first cipher that was decoded successfully, That's not that profound. A teenager could have written that, I do confess that. But some of the other things, though, that we would really want to look at this is just, you gotta ask yourself, could a 15-year-old have murdered Sherry Jo Bates? I was going along with the concept of this probably was the eliminating Sherry Jo Bates, that she wasn't connected to the Zodiac killer mystery, or sorry, to the Louis Myers mystery. If Louis Myers was indeed the Zodiac killer, Sherry Jo Bates was not one of the victims. But this guy is saying, yes, she was. And I'm like, I'm still trying to wonder, is that really what happened in Riverside, California? And once again, on this channel, on these Zodiac Killer uploads, we discuss possibilities, but really, we need to try to get as close to the truth as possible. We're going to examine different suspects